You can't study history without making the acquaintance of historical periods. We have the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and of course the Dark Ages. These names are so much second nature to us that it may come as a shock to realize that someone, somewhere at a particular point in time, devised these terms, and that the people who lived during these periods didn't know that they were living in the Dark Ages or the Renaissance. They thought they were living now. Just like us, they tended to regard the manners and mores of the previous generation as old-fashioned, and to see themselves as trendsetters. Periodization is not necessarily an innocent activity. Names often carry implied negative or positive judgments. Clearly, if an age or period is dark, that's not a good thing, whereas who could possibly object to being called enlightened? To call the period of around 1000 years the Middle Ages is to suggest that it was something of a rather long interlude between more important times. To be called the Middle Ages is an improvement on the Dark Ages, but it's still somewhat derogatory. But the Middle Ages was not just a fallow period between two ages of enlightenment. It was a time of significant change and development, during which the foundations of a modern and contemporary world were laid. Now, I'm not planning on any radical revision of standard periodizations. One nomenclature is as likely to be as tendentious as another. I'm just alerting you to the non-innocent nature of the historical naming process. Forewarned is forearmed. The collapse or rapid decay of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD did not all at once precipitate a political or social crisis. People did not wake up one morning to find a sign posted in the forum saying, "Roman Empire now under new management, apply to Barbarian Enterprises Incorporated." However, some things had changed and changed forever. The highly centralized, highly bureaucratized, legally unified political and military entity that had been the Roman Empire was on its way out. What was to replace it, however, was not yet obvious. Between the 5th and the 9th centuries, the political landscape of the area once controlled by the Western Roman Empire changed forever under the influence of the Germanic tribes now settled there. However, it must not be forgotten that the Roman Empire survived in the east for another 1,000 years until Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453. George Sabine remarks, "The barbarian conquest itself, with its attendant social and economic changes, had made government on a large scale impossible. Both politically and intellectually, Western Europe was beginning to revolve around a centre of its own, instead of being merely the hinterland of a world whose centre was the Mediterranean basin." After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, between the 5th and 7th centuries, the centre of gravity of the Christian barbarian world lay on the shores of the Mediterranean. With the rise of Islam, however, the centre of gravity moved inexorably northwards. The Muslims controlled Corsica, Sardinia and Sicily, and, in the western Mediterranean, the Balearic Islands. Henri Pirenne argues that the rise of Islam effectively separated East from West, and because the Mediterranean was now an Islamic preserve, turned Western Europe into a land-centred culture. As the centuries roll on and we approach the end of the 8th century, the whole coastline of the Christian West was exposed to constant attack and harassment, an attack it was in no position effectively to repel. Adding to the Muslim pressure from the south, the Slavs and Magyars exerted constant pressure in the east. The Norsemen plundered the northern and western coast of the Carolingian Empire and anywhere else that could be reached by water, sometimes even competing with the Muslims for a share of Mediterranean booty. Squeezed from the north and the south, and unable to defend its borders from the Muslims, Norsemen, Slavs and Magyars, the empire of Charlemagne was essentially an inland one. No longer was there any communication with the exterior. It was a closed state, a state without foreign markets, living in a condition of almost complete isolation. Making a point very similar to Pirenne on the isolation and landlocked character of medieval Western Europe, R.W. Sutherland says, "The enclosure of Western Europe at a critical moment in the development of social and political institutions, the practical exclusion from the Baltic, and very limited access to the Mediterranean meant that the land was the unique source of political power and almost the only source of wealth. The ideological thread holding this fragile and threatened society together was the institution of the Christian Church. For the first 300 years of its life, the Church had been a voluntary organization, ignored or persecuted by the secular powers. The conversion of the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century changed everything for both Christianity and for politics. Whether for good or for ill is another matter. In the early days of the new rapprochement, the tendency among Christian leaders was to reject completely the idea that secular rulers could in any justified way have any authority in church matters. But the invocation of the power of the secular ruler to settle intra-church disputes, as for example in the case of the Donatist controversy in North Africa, inevitably ceded, if only in practice, a measure of authority over the church to secular rulers. Over time, however, after the Constantinian settlement, a certain amount of mutual interpenetration developed. The church was part of the empire, but the empire was also part of the church. Pope Gelasius, in the late 5th century, was one of the first to try to outline an account of the proper relationship between the church and society's secular rulers. I deliberately do not use church and state, as the use of such terms in this context is anachronistic. The spiritual and temporal powers are given to two different bodies, each supreme and independent in its own sphere. However independent they might be theoretically, they are also practically interdependent. The king is subject to the bishop in spiritual matters, says Carlyle, the bishop to the king in temporal matters. The working out of the details of this relationship is going to be a constant theme for the next 1,000 years and more of Western history. Christianity affected medieval political thought in a number of ways. Despite numerous practical accommodations and compromises, the spiritual life of religion was conceived of in a way that made it, in principle, independent of the secular power. The story of Christianity in the West is, in part, the story of its entanglement, disentanglement, and re-entanglement with politics, and its sometimes realized, sometimes not realized, independence. This duality of centres of authority, of allegiance, is central to any understanding of Western thought. Neither the spiritual power nor the secular power could command the total allegiance of any person, and the space created by the tension between the two authorities was the breeding ground for liberty. Because it recognized the fundamental worth of every single person, Christianity made possible the emancipation, the eventual emancipation, of the individual from the grasp of the tribe and the clan. For most of human history, the individual has been part of a group, family, village, clan, tribe, or nation. On the Christian conception of man's being made in the image and likeness of God, each individual person reflects and participates in the divine to the extent that any limited creature can do so. Christianity gives to the world a conception of individuality or personality which was unknown to the ancient world, writes Carlyle. The solidarity of the primitive and ancient group was giving way before the development of a new apprehension of individuality. Of course, individualism can be exaggerated to the point where society dissolves into a collection of contingently related human atoms. That may be a possible consequence of individualism, but it's not in any way a necessary consequence. Conservatism in its many forms, whether Burkean or Rousseauian or libertarian, is at least in part an attempt to balance the books on this issue and to ensure that individuals are seen as the socially embedded creatures that they are. Conservatism can also be presented in such a way that it is tantamount to a return to tribalism, perhaps a sophisticated tribalism, but tribalism nonetheless, where the individual is resubsumed into the group. In the case of any libertarian conservatism, all forms of mature human relationship must be voluntary, and the methodological priority of the individual must remain front and centre. Christianity teaches not only the intrinsic worth of the individual, but also the fundamental equality of all individuals. The teaching of the fundamental equality of all human beings is to be found right throughout the New Testament. In the end, distinctions of sex, status, ethnic roots, while real and important on various levels and in various respects, are ultimately insignificant compared to the fact that all have the same value as children of God. You might expect that, armed with this conception of human nature, the Christian impact on the social and political world in which it finds itself would be revolutionary. If that's your expectation, it's going to be disappointed. Instead of turning the social order upside down, Christianity instead seems to have endorsed a passive acceptance of the status quo, even where part of the status quo was slavery. Here is one point on which the Christian view appears to be in essence little different from that of Cicero or Seneca. In fact, Seneca expresses much more forcefully than any passage in the letters of St. Paul or the pastoral epistles the essential odiousness of slavery. When it comes to the Christian conception of the nature of government, the essential text is, as we have seen, Romans 13. Carlyle is surely correct in at least some respects when he says that this passage, which is of the greatest importance throughout the whole course of medieval political thought, being indeed constantly quoted from the 2nd century onwards, is indeed pregnant and significant in the highest degree. He is somewhat less correct when he continues, it defines in the profoundest way the Christian theory of the nature of political society, while it furnishes us with the most interesting evidence with regard to the condition of the Christian societies of the apostolic period. As a matter of historical fact, the overwhelming influence of Romans 13 on all subsequent Christian thought on politics is undeniable. However, we need not be overwhelmed with the multiplicity of uses of this passage, for this strategy amounts to little more than consulting one copy of a newspaper to check the veracity of a story one has read in another copy of the same edition. In the end, it all comes back to Romans 13. What matters is the passage itself, and what it says, which, as we've seen, may well not be what it appears to say. As with the majority of commentators, Carlyle is in no doubt that this Pauline passage demands that Christians obey and respect their secular rulers. He writes, St. Paul's general meaning is plain and distinct, a distinctness that hasn't, Carlyle thinks, prevented later thinkers, he has the Anabaptists in mind, from perverting it. The plain meaning of the passage amounts to this. Government is divinely instituted, and, because of this, resistance to government is rebellion against God himself, because God has instituted government to repress evil and to promote the good. Christian political theory, thus construed, is a towering edifice constructed on the slimmest of scriptural foundations. The narrow scriptural basis of this doctrine of passive obedience in Romans 13 is apparently buttressed by brief passages in Titus, Timothy, and, with perhaps the passage of greatest significance outside Romans being the first letter of Peter. It may well be that these passages are directed, at least in part, to repressing a certain tendency towards antinomianism in the infant Christian community. It requires only a slight study of the apostolic writing to perceive that if the early Christian teachers had hard work to overcome the traditional legalism of the Jew, they were confronted with an almost equally dangerous tendency to anarchism, especially, no doubt, among their Gentile converts. This tendency shows itself first in a disposition to slight the ordinary duties of life, to refuse submission to the discipline of the common life. Thus writes Carlyle. Carlyle remarks significantly that the early church was troubled with anarchical tendencies, very similar to those of some of the Anabaptist movements of the 16th century. I find little to disagree with in this last claim, but its significance for me is that it seems to make the requirement to obey the authorities or powers in Romans to be an internal Christian matter of church discipline, rather than a command to obey the secular authorities. In fact, Carlyle admits that there may be some, just some, indirect justification in Scripture for a less than respectful attitude by Christians to the political authorities. He has in mind Christ's words to his disciples that those entrusted with the rule of Christians were not to be like the Gentile leaders who lorded over others. Rather, Christian leaders were called to service. These words might, Carlyle thinks, induce in the rash and impulsive a contempt for political authorities, as might St. Paul's own injunction to his fellow Christians not to go to law. One might wonder why those who take these words literally are to be denigrated as rash and impulsive, as compared with those who take literally the apparent meaning of Romans 13. In the end, whatever the true or the better or the best interpretation of Romans 13 may be, The early Church's approach to the political order tends more to the Stoics' relative positive conception of the state and its purposes than to the Epicurean attitude of indifference or hostility. On the issue of the natural law, the Fathers of the Church all take their cue from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. The natural law is a law written on men's hearts. The relevant passage runs, "For as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law, and as many as have sinned under law shall be judged by law. For not hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of a law shall be justified. For when Gentiles which have no law do by nature the things of the law, these, having no law, are a law unto themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness therewith." Does this idea in Paul come from his Jewish culture? From his Hellenic environment? Who can say? Whether or which, it dovetails neatly into the Ciceronian idea of the natural law, and ultimately both may well have Greek roots that we find expressed by Sophocles in his Antigone. St. Hilary goes so far as to give an idea of the content of this law. It includes forbidding a man to injure his fellows, to take from them what is theirs, or to engage in fraud. And these are actions that a libertarian would recognize as falling under the non-aggression principle. St. Isidore of Seville seems to take his starting point from Ulpian's account with this difference. Where Ulpian describes the natural law as being common to all animals, St. Isidore describes it as being common to all nations. Like Ulpian, St. Isidore describes the mode of following such a law as being instinctual, but instinct in his case is to be contrasted with convention and not with rationality.